Okay, everyone, welcome again. For some of you, I don't think it's a good morning. For some of you, certainly good afternoon, good evening, and for at least all of us, good night. We're close to the night hour. My name is Dean Piedmont, and I want to welcome you to this session on community as catalyst for successful armed group and actor reintegration. I'm currently a senior advisor for Creative Associates International in Washington, D.C. I work specifically on armed group and actor reintegration issues, specializing in countering violent extremism, and I've spent quite a few years working on DDR issues, and we will unpack for you exactly what those are. So where we will be moving today. We'd like to demonstrate to you the diverse context in which DDR occurs in contemporary conflict settings. To do this, we'll explain exactly what we mean by DDR. And what this does stand for is disarmament, demobilization, and more importantly, reintegration. The key here is for us to convey an understanding that reintegration has a special role when we talk about statutory and non-statutory armed groups and affiliates. We're going to try to convey its importance not only as a program and an operation, but a key understanding that it is part of an economic, a political, and a social process. It involves and is driven by communities and under civilian oversight. We're targeting two cases today specifically. We're going to have two speakers talking to us about the Colombia experience, where we see several DDRs that have occurred, an ongoing reintegration taking place, and this occurring under the rubric of a comprehensive peace agreement. We will then move on to Syria, where we do not have a DDR. We do see increased civil and military coordination. We see community policing, and we see that these are efforts that are needed and being undertaken by non-statutory armed groups and forces, and how they talk to us about the reintegration environment. What our session will do is it will be an interactive session, a moderated panel discussion. We do anticipate audience participation. In our 90-minute session, we have allotted approximately half the time for audience feedback and discussion. Our speakers today, well, the order of our session is we've chosen the speakers and the order to ascend in terms of where we see ourselves in a conflict category, speaking from a peace process or post-conflict process, and descending towards states that are a bit more fragile. While focusing on Nigeria and Syria, we will also touch base where we can, or focusing on Colombia and Syria. We will be touching base on Nigeria as well as a premier example of a successful DDR program. Our speakers today include Christina Pectu. She will touch upon reconciliation, DDR, peace, and stability in Colombia. The focus will be on social cohesion, youth, and the reintegration challenge. Christina is a research associate with the Just Security 2020 project at the Stimson Center. She served the UN Office of Drugs and Crime in Guatemala, DPO and UN Habitat, Youth and Livelihood Unit. Her work on global governance includes strengthening the role of civil society, the management of armed groups, and advancing the UN's youth, peace, and security agenda. Later on, Christina has offered to share a paper with us that she's published, and we'll see that in one of the slides coming up. Sandra Pavone will build on Christina's points on Colombia and will speak to community factors in DDR efforts. Sandra will touch upon women, children, DDR, and reintegration, noting innovations in peace building and positive youth development. Sandra is currently a senior consultant with the Citizen Security Practice Area with Creative Associates. She's a Colombian national with experience in youth prevention, security sector governance, and violence prevention for over 20 years. During her 10 years tenure with USAID Colombia, Ms. Pavone supported the government of Colombia to advance reintegration processes in that country. Finally, we'll move to Omar AlSaraj, and he will speak around political reintegration in Syria, where there is an ongoing insurgency that threatens the state. State forces require reform. Opposition forces are taking legitimate security functions as political actors. We talked about this. There's no DDR per se. However, Syria will show us the need for reintegration when treating both statutory and non-statutory groups. Omar is a political analyst specializing in Syria. He's participated in Geneva consultations and the UN Civil Society Support Room, contributed to the Syrian Transition Roadmap, outlining the political vision for public reforms adopted by the opposition, works with the Transitional Justice Commission, and supports UN-funded programs providing political and non-lethal support to moderate opposition groups. So for our format, for the first 5 to 7 minutes, each of the panelists will describe their work in this area. Afterwards, I will ask 2 follow-up questions to each panelist. They will be given another 5 to 7 minutes to respond. And then we'll go to our Q&A, which we estimate to be about 45 minutes. For the audience, please post your questions in the chat box. Feel free to include your name and affiliation and who the question is directed towards. Kindly note, our session is recorded and we are under the Chatham House rule. When we show PowerPoint presentations, and I believe we have just one slide, a map of Syria, if you can move as an audience member, you can move around the speaker's profile. So feel free to do that so you can get the view that you need, actually. So before moving to our speakers, I want to very briefly talk about a framework for DDR. To give it some idea of its geopolitical positioning, we really need to look back at the last 20 to 30 years, maybe a bit further. So DDR was popularized in the mid-'80s. And as we saw from our Did You Know Fast Facts, DDR is a practice that's been around for over 2,500 years. However, it accelerated since the advent of the UN and mostly since the end of the Cold War. Oftentimes when we talk about DDR, it needs to be revisited. We talk about 3 distinctive iterations or generations of DDR. The first was from the mid-'80s to 2000s. Each encompasses about 15 years. And we saw the end of the Cold War where the Soviet Union and the US government used DDR as a demilitarization and state-building effort. In Southern Africa, new states were formed using DDR as a tool for reintegration and downsizing. Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique are examples. And in Central America, DDR was used widely for demilitarization. Arguably failed attempts at longer-term reintegration is contributing to some of the gang violence there. In the early 2000s to about 7 years ago, we saw DDR being used to address intrastate conflict. These were most commonly associated with very predatory non-state armed actors in states that were fragile and what ended up being failing states. This occurred largely across West Africa and Central Africa, and DDR was adopted under a peace-building agenda. Reintegration became more pronounced, and the base widened to include women, children, and other special needs groups. DDR also became a household name. Over 60 DDRs in the early 2000s were occurring globally. In the last 7 years, we saw DDR being attempted, which it is today, during armed conflict. It was never the original intent and design of DDR, so policies and programs are adapting accordingly, and we see that oftentimes today. One of the difficulties here is we see DDR for a new set of actors. We see them for those that we would call violent extremist organizations, those associated with so-called terrorist organizations. And that is some of what we see occurring in landscapes across the Middle East and North Africa, certainly across large territories across Africa, the Sahel, and the Lake Chad Basin. A consistent theme throughout this, and this comes from an experts level consultation. It pretty much reinforces what we've known, is that irrespective of how we configure a DDR program or DDR type programming, all roads lead back to reintegration. And that is a central theme for what we'll be discussing here. I'd like to move now to Christina Pectu for the start of her presentation. Christina, over to you.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you for the initial very comprehensive overview. That was really helpful, I believe, for both us, the speakers, but also for the audience. And on behalf of the Stimson's Just Security 2020 program, I would like to extend my thanks to you for orchestrating this session, to the Alliance for Peacebuilding for providing this important platform for dialogue, and to the participants for joining us today. I will focus my inputs today on the Colombian DDR program that followed the peace agreement between FARC and the Colombian government in 2016. So let me start by offering an overview of the progress on DDR in Colombia since 2016. And I can speak afterwards more specifically on the role of youth in the reintegration and reconciliation process, as you've mentioned. So since 1982, Colombia has tried to negotiate 7 peace processes and failed 6 times to implement any DDR programs. And as I mentioned, following the adoption of the peace agreement in November 2016, a DDR program commenced. And by July 2017, so approximately a year afterwards, FARC had officially completed the disarmament and the demobilization process, which marked its transformation from an armed group to a political movement. And during this process, more than 8,000 weapons were received and approximately 10,000 combatants demobilized in 24 territorial areas for training and reintegration. However, notwithstanding progress with the disarmament and demobilization part, the reintegration process remains slow and concerns Colombians who fear another failed DDR program, especially in a country that is still plagued by criminal activity, armed groups, and a continuous migration flow from the politically unstable and violent neighbor, Venezuela. So there is a concern that the slow reintegration process could yield high recidivism rates among Colombians' former combatants. And there has been a report of the Ministry of Interior who was actually mentioning that there's been already about 1,800 former combatants that have already recidivated. From December 2016 to December 2018, the reincorporation of children who have a different reintegration track than adult combatants, and my colleague Sandra, I believe, will speak more to it, has been the most successful. That was 67% completed. Followed by political reintegration, approximately 62% completed, and socioeconomic reintegration of adult ex-combatants, and that's the lowest, and that's 43% completed. Social cohesion and reconciliation, as you could tell, remains an intriguing topic among Colombians, fueled partially by society's concerns that the agreement compensates the members of a former armed group, but not the 8 million victims of conflict. Reintegration, of course, entails financial compensation, educational and vocational training, psychological support, and a series of programs meant to smooth the transition from combatant to civilian life. But Colombians often see this process as a privilege that FARC, who is responsible for the death of more than 200,000 people, does not deserve. And this messaging creates, of course, stigma and undermines the process of return for ex-combatants. As such, community acceptance is one of the biggest obstacles to national stability, peace building, and the DDR process itself. Distrust and fear of former combatants inhibits employment in the formal sector, which is fundamental to recovery and reconstruction efforts. And if access to an employment is denied and reconciliation between communities and former combatants becomes arduous, then the socioeconomic reintegration of both communities and ex-combatants will fail. However, despite political polarization and the initial negative result of the 2016 referendum on the peace accord, popular support for the implementation of the peace agreement persists, particularly among the Colombian youth. They have shown remarkable persistence in defending peace, even at the expense, unfortunately, of becoming themselves targets of hate and violence, as we've primarily seen this year, with a number of killings of not only human rights leaders, but also young people and children. So in my paper, Disarmament, Demobilization, and Reintegration Programming with Colombians Youth, which Dean has mentioned, I argue for facilitating and enhancing the young Colombians' role in the reconciliation process, as well as in guaranteeing the successful collective and community-based socioeconomic reintegration of FARC ex-combatants. And I will speak more to it in the next follow-on session. Thank you, Dean. You're on mute.
It was a long time in the making, and it's well worth a read. I do encourage our participants to take a look and to take a read. I'd like to move over now to Sandra Pavone, and Sandra's going to build on and complement what Christina talked about, as well as moving us a bit off-center away from the purist DDR type work, and we'll start to see a bit more of child DDR, violence prevention, and other type of youth activities that take place in a country where there's also a DDR being undertaken. Sandra, over to you, please.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you, Christina. Yeah, I would also like to address and weave in within this discussion how community reintegration has developed. Because as Christina was mentioning, in Colombia, community reintegration is perceived as compensating an inherently unfair process that advantages combatants when compared to victims or unserved communities that are not fully served by the government and live in remote areas. So to answer a little bit of these questions, I would like to briefly touch on the different processes. Christina mentioned the FARC, but as she also mentioned, we've in Colombia lived through a lot of different processes. To talk a little bit about the spoilers and a little bit about the variables that explain why some DDR community reintegration processes are more successful, say, to children or women, as we have said. So yeah, my first point is we have seen several and heterogeneous demobilization and reintegration processes throughout the history in Colombia. So only in the last 20 years, over 75,000 ex-combatants have demobilized and began processes registered by the Colombian government. These processes have different for both right-wing paramilitaries and left group guerrillas. And we will see how these vary. So around 48% of these 75,000, around 32,000, account for the right-wing paramilitary groups. This group is also known as the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, AUC, by its acronym in Spanish, and they were responsible for war and atrocities and massacres throughout 1997 and 2000. The mobilization processes took over 3 years, and different blocks were demobilizing. And what's really telling about this process is that each commander of each block would negotiate different benefits and different processes for each group. So you can see a clear trend on economic reintegration, for example. The processes were more and more demanding towards the last groups. And it's also interesting to see that this process was regulated by the first transitional justice law in Colombia. It's called the Justice and Peace Law, which explicitly prioritized the interests of the victims over the demobilized ex-combatants. So it provides services to ex-combatants, but it was it depended on their participation in truth-telling, reparations, guarantees of non-repetition actions, and social services. And this did make a difference in changing the perception, as Christina was mentioning, that sometimes are very strong nationwide. The members of the guerrilla groups have demobilized in a different way. So when the main groups, say for example, when FARC was a guerrilla or the National Liberation Army, known as ELN, are still active, the government has lured away from these groups the members by the promise of reintegration benefits. And this has been successful for the government of Colombia. This policy is in place since 1984. And this is a counterinsurgency strategy that has attracted many individuals demobilized into the processes. Nevertheless, the 2016 peace agreement between FARC and the government of Colombia was a negotiation that prepared a collective demobilization, and over 13,000, almost 14,000 members participated in this process. Most of them remain active and are law-abiding and very compromised with their reincorporation processes. It is important to say that the FARC was able to keep cohesion among the former combatants within these very specific points that Christina mentioned. These were settings that were placed throughout Colombia, and they were these demobilization reincorporation sites were set up in places that were a little bit outside urban skirts, and they had an internal perimeter that was controlled by the FARC, and then an external security perimeter that was controlled by the Colombian army. And I go into these details because I will show, again, these structures did not allow much for community reintegration. So the interaction with the communities was not as active as it has been in previous processes. It was important, though, to mention that within this 4-year negotiation, there were issues such as collective memory, the review of causes of conflict, the role of women, and gender implications that did affect the reintegration process, and it changed the way some actions and some processes are taking place. Briefly, I would like to talk about the spoilers, and some of them also came up in Christina's conversation. I would like to touch a little bit on security, on fragmentation, and the lack of transparency. So regarding security, the shadow of insecurity for former combatants, it's justified in Colombia. The most shameful example is the Unión Patriótica group. This was a splinter of the guerrillas, and within 8 years, most of their members were selectively followed and killed. But it's not only happening with left group guerrillas. Almost 10% of the right-wing paramilitaries were killed within their first 3 years of demobilization. And we are seeing that over 260 FARC ex-combatants from the peace process have been killed throughout these last 4 years. So there is a justified fear from ex-combatants, which is also perceived sometimes as a negative behavior from receptor communities. Fragmentation, well, Colombia has lived through several DDR processes in most of the cases because there are always groups that splinter. So the conflict continues, and some of them continue to be involved in legal activities. For example, in the paramilitary process, there were very good benefits for commanders and attractive benefits also for rank boots, but commanders were not really attracted by this offer of reintegration. Many of them did not demobilize, or some of them just went back to carry on with illegal activities and conflict. And as we have seen since the signature of the peace process in 2016, some FARC dissidents never made it into the reincorporation processes. So this, unfortunately, cycle does not allow for full demobilization or end of the conflict. Finally, on the lack of transparency, the demobilization and peace negotiations are always criticized for not being made out publicly. This generates a little bit of criticism and rejection from some members of society. Some of the critics involving, for example, the paramilitary process were around inflated numbers of demobilized fighters, or that some blocs were actively involved in illegal activities. And then the continued violence by spoiler factions has always generated that these processes are not as smooth and as complete as we were all waiting for. Again, all these perceptions hurt the perception from the receptor communities, and these asymmetries of assistance between a very prompt support to ex-combatants versus victims of the conflict do not help. Child soldiers is another very sad chapter in the last negotiations. In the case of the paramilitaries, many children were asked to leave the camps before the demobilization actually took place, and many criticized the very small number of children that were part of the peace negotiation back in 2016. And finally, very briefly, I would like to say that beyond the community level of openness or the legal frameworks that are set under each negotiation, the political nature of the peace negotiations, depending on who's in power and international variables, there are also other elements that explain how community reintegration has been successful or not. And these range between personal attitudes, group affiliation, age range, gender, and the level of cohesion of former ex-combatants associations, which have played a huge role. And we can see that in the FARC reincorporation process. For example, and just a final example, I would say within indigenous communities, reintegration is understood as a cleansing process to heal the soul that has been affected by violent spirits. And this is a community exercise. Even though the family is held accountable for this process, the full community is supportive in this process. So I would say, in conclusion, that social and political participation of ex-combatants has been proven as a remedy for recurrence of recidivism or social conflict, but it really changes. And in Colombia, we have a range of examples of very successful community reintegration, and we can talk a little bit about what are the specific implications, say, for groups of women ex-combatants or child soldiers. Dean, you're in mute.
Am I still on mute? Imagine this. All right. I'm IT challenged, putting it very mildly. Sandra, that's rich. It really is. And Colombia is always a rich case to look at. What I want to do is, we said we're going to hear from Ahmad next, and then I was going to do follow-up questions with our panelists. However, because we're unpacking so much, should panelists have questions, I'll intersperse it. After Ahmad speaks, I'll go to some of the audience, and then I can always ask my questions later on. And I think this might be important because a lot of issues are rising right to the surface. And we started off talking about the centrality of reintegration, but we noted right from the start, when we look at DDR programs, we often ask the question, where's my vocational training? Where's my job? And it's a mistake for, I guess, two reasons. One, DDR is much more complex than that. Peace and conflict is much more complex than that. And that's never really worked because it's never really addressed the totality of the problem. And I think Christina and Sandra, you're opening this up quite nicely. It's impossible to talk about DDR and reintegration of armed groups and let's say statutory and non-statutory forces in Colombia without talking about politics and the political process. And when we do so, we talk about spoilers. We're talking about inclusiveness, and we're also talking about security concerns. Now, very interestingly, you're raising the issue of there's a peace agreement, but commanders are negotiating bilaterally. So you have several complex political processes going on. Each of you have talked about disarmament, but in our Did You Know, I state disarmament is ceremonial. We have to unpack, if we can, whether or not collecting weapons or what role disarmament plays in reintegration, if any. Is it a necessity? Is it necessary? Is it preferred? Is it realistic? Very interesting in Colombia is the notion of collective reintegration. Now, there are three types of reintegration you've pointed to. The individual getting benefits, the community, we talk about victims, we're opening up the social space, and the collective. And this requires keeping together former combatants in a socially cohesive format. Is this preferred? Under what conditions is it preferred? Is it necessary? One can argue you need to do it in a place like Colombia. It will be extraordinarily difficult not to do it in Afghanistan, where the Taliban may or may not be negotiating with the government. Yet you're going to find very few people who will find this acceptable for the large resistance army, for groups like Boko Haram and ISIS. So this notion of social cohesion and how it fits into reintegration is important. I think it also speaks to a lot of what we see happening in Syria, as there's no DDR process, but all of these issues, all of these contingencies and conditions are applicable to look at reintegration. Economic, social, political, and I would add security elements of reintegration. With that, I'd like to hand over to Omar to walk us through his experience in Syria and invite our audience to start posting in the chat box any questions or comments. I'm welcoming comments as well that you may have, and I'm happy to front load those after Omar speaks. Omar, over to you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Dean. And thank you so much for this smooth change to Syria after this nice discussion about DDR. I'm going to talk about ongoing conflict now, and hopefully we'll see a DDR program in Syria soon. We'll just try to give a brief about the military development within the Syrian conflict. As you all know, the Syrian conflict started in 2011 as part of the Arab Spring and Arab uprisings. In summer 2011, the Syrian regime started using the military forces to end some protests in the south of Syria and also in the northeast in Deir ez-Zor. This unjustified action from the Syrian government pushed many officers from the military to defect, and later establishing what we used to call the Free Syrian Army to protect these communities, and also to later to dethrone or trying to dethrone the Syrian regime. Later in 2012 and 2013, as we were seeing changes in Egypt, in Yemen, in Tunisia, and Libya, the Syrians expected that the change in Syria is also coming soon. Groups of Syrian politicians, academics, journalists, and activists were discussing how to develop a transition plan in Syria. In 2012, group of Syrians worked on what called then the Day After Plan, and then also another group developed the Syria Transition Roadmap, which both discussed deeply establishing a national and professional army in Syria, as like Syrians in that time were seeing how the Syrian army were acting against communities supported the uprising. We also saw in that early stage of the conflict social justice concepts entering the political discourse in Syria, including social reconstruction, national reconciliation, establishing a fact-finding commission, compensation for victims, and also reforming the general institutions like the police, the security forces, and also the military. These plans were praised by the Western government, including the United States, and also by the Arab League. And then the Syrian opposition also adapted these plans. In 2014, the Syrian opposition established the Syrian Commission of Transitional Justice. And the main mission of that commission was to develop a strategic plan for transitional justice in Syria. However, after that, and especially starting from 2014, and let's say the U.S. inconsistent policy in Syria, adding to the failure of the UN-sponsored political negotiations in Geneva, and then the emerge of ISIS, and then also the Russian military intervention in October 2015. All of these things factored in making the Syrian opposition irrelevant to the Syrian conflict, and all of these plans were aside since then. Militarily, until 2018, or actually by into 2018, when the regime captured most of the opposition stronghold areas in the south of Syria, the war map became almost frozen. And then in February 2020, it was completely frozen, as I think you can see in a map later. This map was taken in 28th of November 2020. This map is almost the same since February, which wasn't the case throughout the conflict. These colors represent different military groups. By December, as you see here, these three colors, which dominates the Syrian map, you see here the big red area is under the regime control, which is supported by Russian, Iranian forces, and also militias from Lebanon, Iraq, and also Afghanistan. The green areas are opposition-held areas with also military control from Turkey, like strong military presence from Turkey. And also the yellow area is the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is led by Kurdish groups and supported by the International Coalition Against ISIS, and also, for sure, the US government. While the front lines are almost frozen, the conflict is still ongoing because there is no political progress in Syria. Until now, the Syrian opposition and also the regime failed to have any step forward in the negotiations, thanks to the Syrian regime, which did not which did not approach the negotiations in a serious way at all. But there are also other factors make the political solution in Syria a little more complicated. First of all, the opposition institutions literally have been irrelevant since 2016. Hayat Tahrir Sham, which and its governing body, which called the Salvation Government, they control Idlib, which is the northwest of Syria, this green area, most of this green area. This group is classified as a terrorist organization by the US government and many other governments, which severely limits political and development support to opposition-held areas from Arab countries and also Western governments. The other area, which is in the northeast, the yellow area, it's controlled by Kurdish-led group, Syrian Democratic Forces. These groups are linked to Turkey-based Kurdistan Workers' Party, PKK, and this group is also classified by Turkey as a terrorist group, which makes it also more complicated since Turkey has the majority of, Turkey is on the northern border of Syria, and has strong presence inside Syria too. Then the regime insists that the majority of the Syrian opposition, including moderate opposition and political leaders, are terrorists and traitors. We hear that from Bashar al-Assad, the president of the regime, all the time. So there is a fear of the Syrian regime. This fear discourages IDPs, refugees to return to Syria, and also discourages armed groups to give up their weapons and also involve in regime-led programs and activities. By the way, the regime tried to develop a DDR plan in southern Syria, in areas were under opposition control in 2017. And actually, the plan wasn't the regime's plan. It was a Russian plan. Russia established what is called reconciliation offices. It's led by Russia and headed by Russian officers. These reconciliation offices try to organize and convince actually former opposition armed groups to agree on a settlement with the Syrian regime. Then Russia sponsored the formation of the 5th Corps in the Syrian army, which include all opposition fighters who signed this reconciliation as a settlement with the regime. And most of them were, and will allow also defected officers to return to their position in the regime army. However, this plan completely failed. It is the 5th Corps still exists, but this plan, no other community in Syria want to go through it, the same experience. Most of these groups many of them were either kidnapped, arrested, or killed, and they believe that these were by regime officers or regime groups, pro-regime groups. So there is lack of trust with the Syrian regime when it comes to this kind of settlement. I have a couple of things more to discuss, but I think I already passed my time, so I will go back to you, Dean, and then probably continue later.
Omar, we're doing quite well on time. I would encourage you to continue with your point, sir.
Yeah, thank you so much. I would say that at this moment and this point, many of the armed groups in Syria are carrying their weapons due to lack of other options. For example, in the regime side, many of these groups, many militias supported by the regime or used to fight in this regime side, were benefiting from military operations, were also benefiting from looting and from checkpoints to also get money from people. These groups are now jobless. They don't have anything to do, and they don't have any more operations. There is no mobilization anymore for them. So many of them started to do security operations, support, protect convoys, fuel trucks, and also other goods coming from the north to regime areas. The regime also and several governments used Syrian militias as manpower in regional conflicts out of Syria. So there is quite big problem related to these armed groups, and I think these people are suffering of these problems, but unfortunately, lack of political solution in Syria and the lack of international support, especially from the United States, has been a problem. Last thing on this, I would say that the current, the former, let's say, administration in the United States decided in 2017 to cut all support on financial support on the Syrian opposition. When we say the Syrian opposition, we mean the moderate groups, which were which were supported, which were representing the majority of the Syrian uprising, whether militarily or politically. This decision by the U.S. government helped to damage severely the Syrian opposition, and also supported strongly the radical groups like Hayat Tahrir al-Sham to take control of large areas from the Syrian opposition and be the dominant force in the northwest of Syria, which also made the situation in Syria more complicated. Now back to you, Dean.
Thank you very much, Omar. Fantastic stuff. We have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to go to those. I want to highlight a couple of very interesting points from Omar's presentation. With very little exception, and it was the association of the need to stay armed, there's very little talk about socioeconomic issues related to reintegration in Syria. It's largely governed around security issues. And I would say, Omar, you're making a very interesting case for a state building type of exercise. And if we recall what I had talked about earlier, excuse me, crazy cat, when we talk about the DDR efforts from the 80s, at the end of the Cold War, there was an engagement of the Soviet Union and the United States. And we're going to move to a question from Alex Borkholder in a minute, because he asks about international administration. However, when the US and Russia engaged some 20, 30 years ago, even longer, it was a state building exercise. And very interesting to find that that's currently the case again. In Southern Africa, economic development and state building was an enterprise, but socioeconomic reintegration of ex-combatants was not. And you had talked about, Omar, the labeling of several groups as terrorist organizations. One question I would have for the audience and for the group would be quite simply, is FARC a terrorist organization? Does FARC have to be treated differently than groups like Boko Haram and ISWA, ISIS West Africa? And further to this, the groups that were demobilized and reintegrated during the original state building exercise, they were terrorist organizations until they became liberation struggles. And these are how these states were built. It was on the transformation, the political reintegration and transformation of these groups. We have two questions, and the first one, I'll just fan out to the team. And then the second one, I saw that Christina wanted to answer it, and then I'll ask Sandra, if Omar, if you want to as well, please go ahead. And the first one is from Professor Dr. Danielle Cumming, and she asks, she notes that there is a slow progress in reintegration in Colombia. Then when Omar had talked about the Syrian issue, it was done with reference to international actors and regional actors. What is the role, if any, that Venezuela plays in the reintegration process for Colombia, either as stabilizing or destabilizing the environment, or is it a separate issue altogether? And the second question from Alex Borkholder, are there examples of successful DDR programs that are administered by international actors? Or, by definition, do they have to be undertaken by the home country to be effective? Both very, very compelling questions. Would anyone like to take the first one? And this is on the role of its neighbor Venezuela plays in reintegration or Colombian peace building and stabilization through reintegration lens.
Sandra, would you like to go first, or I can go first and then you can comment?
Yeah, I don't mind. Do you want me to start?
Please go first.
Yeah, okay.
Yes.
So regarding the first question, I would say, well, it's a little bit mix of both, but I would say the Colombian reintegration process is quite strong and sophisticated because it's run precisely fully by the Colombian government, being supported by international donors. There's actually a very sophisticated M&E verification process around the last peace process, but also in the early 2000s, when the integration was taking place, there was also an international verifier. So I think the process is actually quite strong because it's precisely led by the Colombian government. Regarding the Venezuelan influence, there is no direct implication, or not as much, but I would say it has been affected in the sense that, by Venezuela, in the sense that many guerrilla groups, we've heard students and ELN members can go and escape pressure from the Colombian army within their borders, within the Venezuelan borders. There's quite a long border between Venezuela and Colombia, so it's very easy to cross it. It's quite challenging to fully hold that crossing lines. So I would say that to the extent that it's easier for illegal groups or guerrilla groups to cross that border, and in some cases it's perceived to be a safe haven for some of these groups, then there is this influence from the Venezuelan government, right? That's how I see it. There's also, the drug trafficking in Colombia is still taking place. Some of the transit routes take place through Venezuela. Some of them are also run by illegal groups linked to some of these dissidents. So yeah, I would find those are the links. I don't know, Christina or Dean, if you want to complement.
Sandra, thank you. Very, very well done. Christine, I know that you had studied this for some time when you were developing your paper. What can you tell us about the Venezuelan connection, or say more implications for how it may affect Colombian youth reintegration?
Yeah, so I might just add, in addition to what Sandra said, the fact that, Colombia is facing a double reintegration challenge, I would say. One of them, of course, is reintegrating FARC ex-combatants, and then the other challenge is integrating, not reintegrating, but integrating in the Colombian society Venezuelan refugees. And there is a challenge there because both of them are kind of looking for the same thing, which is economic opportunities mostly, and also social integration in the communities. Of course, you would imagine, and both, by the way, because Sandra mentioned that we have collective reintegration taking place on the side of FARC, and also we know that generally where you have refugee populations, they tend to stick together. So that poses also challenges because, of course, community reintegration and integration becomes much harder. So there's, of course, this vicious cycle where you have a growing population that needs socioeconomic support from the government. And then you also have on the other side victims of conflict, which are, by the way, not piecemeal numbers. These are 8 million people. And you also have a very polarized society, which of course is polarized, of course, because of the peace agreement, but it's also polarized also when you're looking at what's happening in Venezuela and the various tendencies that people have in terms of being welcome to the idea of bringing Venezuelans into Colombia or not. Although, let's remember the fact that Colombia has actually been one of the countries Colombians themselves have benefited from Venezuela welcoming them back, at the beginning of conflict at least. So now it's somehow the country is trying to return this, but definitely a challenge in that area. And then with regard, would you like me to also answer the other question related to more broadly to country ownership and international actors? I think when we definitely, I don't really see a possibility of having a successful DDR program without the country having ownership of the program, and without the country being at least very much invested into the reintegration component, at least. Because let's remember that reintegration, reincorporation, reconciliation, these are long-term processes that span throughout years. It can take 3, 5, 10 years for actually ex-combatants to be able to integrate in communities. So you cannot really do that without having the government support. Now, on the flip side, you do have international actors that are supporting programming. And here we can specifically call on the UN, there's a DDR unit within the Department of Peacekeeping Operations of the UN who are supporting generally national processes and programming when they take place. There's DDR units generally in peacekeeping missions where they exist. And in Colombia, there's a UN verification mission, which is actually verifying the implementation of the peace agreement, but is not implementing it per se. So there's a difference there. And then you also have institutions, global institutions such as the World Bank, the International Organization for Migration, who are very much also invested in these processes, particularly on the reintegration front. Now, there's a problem, of course, when we speak about foreign fighters, when we speak about terrorist groups, as you said, Dean, when we have designated terrorist groups, because especially when we have foreign fighters, because no country, unfortunately, wants to reintegrate foreign fighters in their own country. So that's where you have a dilemma where you have ex-combatants who would like to reintegrate, who would like to go through a DDR program, but then you have actually a legal challenge, mostly where countries simply don't want to take these fighters back, or they are just being passed through different countries without any sort of clarity of where they should actually be reintegrated.
Thank you very much.
Maybe you have more to add, I'm sure.
There's a lot here to unpack. I'm gonna consolidate it very quickly, and then I do have a follow-up question that I'm gonna pose to Omar to see where DDR does and does not fit. And I will, Alex, address your question as well here. So Alex had asked about the issue of national ownership. Outside funding is almost always a requirement, and Christina and Sandra talked about the need for strong ownership, but yet the existence of strong ownership by the government. And I would pose the question of we have to ask the question, what does that mean? The average cost, per capita cost for DDR, this statistic is a few years old, is $1,200. For every ex-combatant, the international community will pony up, let's say, $1,500. In Colombia, the government has dedicated, this was years ago, $10,000. So the Colombian government could turn to the international community and say, we do support this. It's been run through our own commission, the ACR, and we have put up more per capita than most of the countries have ever considered. At the same time, there's a border issue. There's Venezuelans. There's the politicization of the reintegration issue, and now we start to see socioeconomic issues coming right to the fore. If you're demobilizing, let's say, young men, and in the case of Colombia, young women, and they need to get a livelihood, and they're living near a border, and you have Venezuelan refugees who will work for 1/3, 1/5 the price, you're creating a potential, you're setting up the potential for failure. Alex, to your point, part of the issue is about political will. And one of the questions DDR practitioners make when they enter the reintegration space is, do we find ourselves in a position where DDR can succeed and reintegration fail? And that's a question that we often don't ask enough. We don't pull it apart enough. And that is something that does feed into national ownership. And certainly I think the international community owns some of that as well, especially when you do a very proficient operation, and yet 5 years later, you're doing it again and again. In the Congo and DRC, they've been doing DDR for 25 years, and they do them very well, and they succeed. Yet, where is reintegration? In Colombia, you do have strong ownership in a polarized society. And in one of the areas where you would expect it would be the most difficult to do successful DDR, Northeast Nigeria, IOM, with the support of the US government, is doing an exemplary job of reintegrating one of the toughest known groups on earth, former members of Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa. So it is very much a mixed bag. Omar, I do want to pose a question to you, and just to flag for us all, we're doing quite well on time. And then after this question, I will go back. I see the audience is coming through with some more questions. And thank you to Alex and to Dr. Cumming for their contributions. Ahmad, we note that Syria, and you've highlighted this, it's about peace processes. It's about transition, and it's about political roadmaps. It is not about DDR. Can you tell us, yet in 2017, the Russians were interested in this thing we call DDR. Can you tell us if DDR is relevant in Syria? And if so, how and when could this take place? What would it look like? And I'm looking for you to talk through some of your experience as a Syrian specialist. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, I think it's relevant. According to the UN, by the mid of 2018, and we are talking about frozen conflict or almost frozen conflict, there were 350,000 fighters inside Syria. We're talking about a country with almost 24 million people. Now 10 million Syrians are displaced, 6 million are refugees, and we have almost 350,000 militants. As I mentioned earlier, at this point of the conflict, many fighters carry weapons due to lack of other available options. Many of the fighters in Syria are young men who grew up throughout the conflict, and their job was to fight. Like, they were receiving salaries and support to their families just to keep fighting or keep being in these front lines. And as also mentioned before, there were militias, whether with the regime or other also radical groups, were benefiting from conflicts and from fight, and they were depending on looting and also charity, and which were supporting their fighters. Now these are gone, and these groups are jobless. The UN Commission of Inquiry, in their report in early September 2020, the report accused the Syrian opposition of committing crimes and violations against human rights in areas under their control. And they suggested in the report that the main reason of these violations is lack of salaries and lack of financial sources for these groups. I would say that when there were constant support and monitoring of these groups from the international donors, there were more accountability, and there were more, let's say, respect of human rights, and we did not hear of these violations. Now, I think that, so I would say that DDR is a need in Syria, definitely, but in this point of the conflict, and again, we're talking about country with a collapsed economy, with 10 million or 11 million displaced people, 6 million refugees. It's hard to imagine that the Syrian community the Syrian communities can process like reintegration and reconciliation. I think it must come from the regional forces, which are now leading the military actions inside Syria. So I think that the peace process and also the reconciliation in Syria need direct intervention from regional and international forces.
Omar, thank you for that. And it brings us right back. We start elevating again. So we get into the weeds a bit in Colombia. We start to see the socioeconomic issues, and then we get back into the larger geopolitical issues, politics in Colombia, and then the much wider issues and the relevance of a political DDR and political reintegration in this case, in Syria. We have three questions, and I want to address them. We have one from Britt Sloan, and I want to combine this with one from Deborah Mancini, and then Ali Spring. I'm not forgetting you in here, so that's going to be directed back towards Sandra and Christina. And I'm going to go, Deborah. I'm going to start with yours, and then I'm going to move into Britt's, and they feed into each other. So I'll just read them out. And Britt's is definitely a nice, sharp one. Relating to the prior question, to what extent do reintegration initiatives you have seen address psychological factors at the individual or community level? In what ways do they affect men, women, boys, and girls differently? What about future programming? I'm going to address this briefly and then hand it over to our team. I'll ask them to address it quickly should they have something to say on this. We've been talking about psychosocial reintegration for almost 2 decades, a solid 15 years. And the difficulty in DDR programs has been it's much easier to put metrics against socioeconomic reintegration, which is actually false. It's easier to say how many people you've trained to be a carpenter that may or may not get jobs in carpentry. It's much harder to quantify psychosocial support, but it's been there. It's been there since the Brahimi years in early 2000, when children, women, elderly persons, and affiliates, not bona fide ex-combatants, became part of the caseload. Probably one of the most cutting-edge examples of psychosocial support that the international community can learn from. And it won't be able to do so till next year. There's currently an evaluation and study underway. It's going to be in Northeast Nigeria. And as a matter of necessity, in Northeast Nigeria, the US government with IOM preloaded or front-loaded psychosocial support because the caseload was so volatile. Boko Haram and ISIS West Africa. And this was done in transition centers through the rehabilitation part of DDR. So there was no DDR. There is disengagement, demobilization, which doesn't occur, rehabilitation and reintegration, or it might even be a reconciliation. We have DDR soup. What happens in the pre-release phase is Operation Safe Corridor, that's the program. They get psychosocial support and they get vocational training. Families they get family visits. They get visits from family members, community leaders, from other armed groups, service providers, civil joint task force, and community leaders. Upon release, there's no more vocational training. Probably one of the smartest programming advents I've seen in a while. They get increased business support, but the former fighters in this case are reporting that the psychosocial support, more than anything else, has helped them to develop patience and help them to modify their behavior. More than anything else, communities are observing the rehabilitation, the conference of legitimacy by the government, and the change in behavior of people who are coming back versus people who are coming back without the benefit of a DDR program, and saying this psychological change is exactly what we need to accept these people back. So we see an opportunity for a massive investment in a new area that for the first time we can qualify and quantify. And Britt had noticed, rightfully, that the DDR process in Northeast Nigeria is deeply flawed, particularly at the level of community-level social reintegration. And Britt would like to hear our thoughts about how to measure successful DDR during an active conflict, which is most DDRs currently occurring today. Now, the difficulty with Britt's question is you're correct, and yet there are extraordinary successes, and these are counterintuitive, but they're occurring in the same theater, the same environment. The difficulty of doing this during conflict, of course, is that you're asking people to go home during a conflict, so you have a security dilemma. You can't run a 3-year program, so you have to run it until the conflict stops, or it stops getting funded, which is unfortunate in a place like Nigeria because you have successful programming. But now you're asking more specifically about markers of success. One marker of success in Nigeria, in the DDR program, there is not one example of a person who has become a recidivist. That's extraordinary. Will it last? We don't know, but we know of the 800 to 900 people that have gone through the program, not one has returned to this armed group. Unlike other cases, certainly unlike Colombia. We know that even in an ongoing insurgency, where people have and communities have been deeply wounded and affected and victimized, traumatized, communities are indeed accepting back these persons. It takes a while to do. After a year of reintegration, that acceptance turns into trust. There hasn't been a known example of violence perpetrated by an ex-combatant on a community member after return, or vice versa. In operational terms, the pipeline is moving. In 2 years, Nigeria went from moving 6 people through a pipeline, a pilot, if you will, to 900. So mechanisms, standard operating procedures, whatever is needed to be in place is in place, even though, as you said, it's quite flawed. There are indications, we talked about the psychosocial support, and there are indications that national funding and contributions are lending itself to this effort. You don't see a DDR dependency syndrome where the international community is footing the bill. So very interesting there. I would invite any other of our panelists to address those 2 issues, and I'm happy to reread them, considering I pretty much just dictated a book out here. So to any of our panelists. Excellent. That doesn't happen very often.
Well, let me just add one point, maybe. I see Sandra has.
I have questions. Don't feel pressure. There's no shortage of questions in your future. So go on.
No, I mean, I definitely want to respond to Ali's question whenever you're ready for that. But I will also add on actually measuring DDR success in a conflict setting. That probably what you can also see is that progress with, I would say not the DDR, not the DZ per se, but with maybe parts of the reintegration process and sort of that R, can also allow, provide the space and the environment for actually developing and negotiating a peace agreement. Because what it can happen is that also ex-combatants, it truly depends from one case to another, of course, but sometimes these programs can also address polarization in a country. So that can be helpful towards the different parties coming together and being able to negotiate a peace agreement. But also, it could provide also platforms for these ex-combatants to actually, or political platforms, I mean, to actually be able to conduct their political agenda, unless it's a terrorist agenda, of course, in a way that it's that doesn't require the use of violence. So yeah, I would add these to what you have very well already highlighted, Dean.
This is great, Christina. And what I'm going to do now is move to Ali's question, and we'll put us back in Camp Colombia. And then, Omar, I'm going to come back to you as we're starting to talk again about this notion of the politics and the security, noting that terrorist organizations cannot provide it, or if there's a terrorist agenda. I want to be very careful with that term. But then I do want to, because the Middle East and MENA is absolutely fascinating to me, so we'll bring it back around there again. Noting we have 15 minutes left just for our audience and our panelists. Marianne is interested to learn about gendered aspects of reintegration Operation Safe Corridor in Northeast Nigeria. And Marianne, after this, through the Alliance for Peacebuilding, please get in touch with us. Myself with USAID through Creative Associates will be publishing the evaluation, and it has a lot to say about gender, women, reintegration, and DDR in Northeast Nigeria. We plan not only to publish that, but to do a series of speaking engagements and events around that as well, again, with the support and endorsement of the US government. There's no shortage of lessons learned and innovations. For Ali's question, I have to scroll. I'm scrolling now. And this is for our Colombia contingent. How might the ACIERE, the Colombian Reintegration Agency, be collaborating with the Ministry of Education, it says Jardín Sena Universities, to achieve the country's peace building and community integration objectives through educational initiatives? And Sandra, I'll hand it over to you first, and then Christina, if you'd like to supplement, and then I will move to Ahmad for a question on community policing. Over to you.
Thank you, Dean. I'll start with a clarification. The institutionality, the country changed from ACR to the now called Agency for Reincorporation and Normalization. They have regional offices. As I understand, there's one in Cartagena. Coming from of the dimensions, one of the areas that it's included in this reintegration route, it's involving local actors, and that includes educational local actors. There is quite a range of people that arrive into these processes. They are from child soldiers that have problems holding a pen because they lost their skills. No, there's the mobility skills of writing that you got after you have been attending a full school. And then there are also cases of people that had gone through the university. So for all these cases, there are different coordination with local service deliveries, including what's mentioned, the Vocational Skills Training Institute called SENA, and other offers. So they are included and they're coordinated through regional offices. If you allow me, Dean, I would just like to add a little bit on the psychosocial support. I think it's important also to say that the Colombian case includes strong psychosocial support for very strong affectations, traumas that have undergone through different groups. But also there is a very interesting and successful experience when these psychologists are involved in economic reintegration, because it's not only ex-combatants who face anxiety and angst when they are applying for a job and preparing for an interview, but it's also the private sector, right, that's concerned about hiring ex-combatants, right? So these groups of psychologists and social workers have become really useful in bridging those fears. And private sector feel very comfortable when they know there is a psychologist behind each one of these former combatants, and that these processes are not left alone. And I would say this long-term support and dialogue between these groups, social workers and psychologists that are set up by the government, are also a good way to measure how successful the program has been. At some point, there was a 3-year monitoring process after graduation, and that meant following up. It was voluntarily, but it encompassed more than 90% of participants, which gave us percentages of how many former combatants were law-abiding, even their processes were over and finished. And then again by recidivism for international standards. I don't know if we want to finish this question and then we can get a little bit into the nuances of women and child soldiers differences. Dean?
Sandra, what I'm going to do is move very quickly to Christina for 2 minutes and then to Ahmad. We're running short on time. And I do want to leave and encourage our audience members to drop us their email, and we do want to post a slide that shows some of the more recent thinking through publications on the issue. But this is very insightful. One last note on psychosocial support, in my estimation, is that there is this tendency, it's a Western tendency to say, yes, we're doing DDR and we need psychologists and then you have 50,000 combatants and good luck, trying to find that many psychologists. In an appropriate transition and exit strategy, from my experience, community members are well positioned to be trained to take care and support the psychosocial needs of their community. And this includes former fighters and their affiliates. And this would be another enormous innovation in this area. Christina, if you could give us a response and limit your response to 2 minutes, it'd be appreciated. We're at 8 minutes left, and then I'll go over to Omar, and we'll probably move to close from there. Britt, thank you for your comment, and we'll definitely be looking forward to sharing the evaluation once we get it. And please, for our audience members, share your email addresses with us if you're interested to remain in contact. And over to you, Christina.
Dina, I might need 2.5 minutes.
It's going to be 2.5, but then I do want to give this to Omar, so keep it tight.
All right, I will. I just wanted to mention I didn't get the opportunity to go in depth into the research that I did for the paper, but I will share the link in the box so that people can read it. But basically, just to answer Ali's question, it's not going to be as specific as to offer examples in terms of what the Ministry of Education can do, but more broadly on what Colombia can do and the government of Colombia in terms of including youth in the DDR process, actually, and not thinking about DDR as a process that needs to where young people are generally beneficiaries of the process, but a process that can be done in partnership with youth. And then, of course, this builds on the Youth, Peace and Security resolution that was adopted by the Security Council in 2015. And with that being said, I think one of the recommendations that I would have for the Colombian government is that Colombia is one of the only countries that it's very well positioned to actually adopt and implement a national action plan on youth, peace, and security. No country thus far, I know that there are a couple of them are working on it, but I'm not aware of any country thus far implementing a national action plan on youth, peace, and security. So this could be a great opportunity for Colombia to secure youth access in the decision-making process and constructively integrating them in peace-building efforts, of course, including DDR processes. So that would be one of my recommendations. The second one would be to strengthen the role of Colombia Joven. Colombia Joven is actually a platform that is coordinated by the administrative department of the Presidency of the Republic, which looks to promote more broadly youth national policy. So this platform can actually be strengthened and have in its function the ability to for capacity building for young people to develop projects focused on socioeconomic reintegration of ex-combatants, on reconciliation and social cohesion. So the platform can, in this sense, be offering this capacity building. In addition, could also be an online learning tool for integrating courses and toolkits and explaining how DDR works and how young people can actually participate in the reintegration.
I'm going to ask you to wind it up. You're moving on. I want to give a couple minutes to Omar, please. So please.
Yes. So maybe the final one will be, of course, to partner with youth more broadly to promote reconciliation and social cohesion. And to speak also to another question, Dina Lomi,
Christina, I do want to hand over to Omar. So if you can, please wrap it up. It would be appreciated.
Then I'm going to leave it just here. Thank you.
We are down to about 3 minutes, and we are getting some email from the audience. So please do continue to engage. Christina, thank you for that. I know we can go on for hours on this. Omar, if you could tell us just a couple of words on how you see the role of community policing in Syria and reintegration. I think that would be a fine way to start getting ready to wrap this up. And I do want to extend my apologies to Dan Owen, a colleague and friend from the World Bank, who I missed his question and only wish we had more time. I have been told there will be a hard stop, so we will be cut off in 3 minutes or 4 minutes, whether we like it or not. Over to you, Omar.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that up until this month, all sides of the Syrian conflicts are still recruiting, are still carrying out conscription campaigns, despite that the front lines are frozen for many reasons. Some of them are for good reasons, like they don't want, at least in the northeast, the Syrian Democratic Forces, they don't want young men to go to be recruited by ISIS or to be driven in the wrong way. There is another problem regarding to armed groups, especially in opposition-held areas. These groups many of them were forced to leave their areas and swap territories with the Syrian government. Like the Syrian regime and the opposition agreed to change, to make a demographic change, to move entire villages and towns from the governorate to another, like in a swap deal, to end like a military conflict. These groups are now in different and new locations. These locations do not easily accept them or give them the leverage they used to have in their hometowns. And the last thing is ISIS. ISIS is still active in Syria. It's not exist anymore as a state, but now it's hundreds of cells in opposition areas, especially in the northeast. The other thing is regarding to ISIL is their families. Now their families are not accepted in many communities, so they are in camps. There is a whole camp in Al-Hasakah province. It includes 65,000 people. Almost 10,000 of them are foreigners, 30,000 of them are Iraqi, and 20,000 are Syrians. The camp is a disaster. There is like a clear lack of security and frequent assassinations and security incidents almost every day, and also very poor services provided by local authority. The local authorities appealed consistently the international community to intervene with, and there were no serious response. There is legitimate fear of a new generation of ISIS growing within these camps, and when children in 13 or 14 years old entered these camps, they are now 18 and they receive no psychosocial support. They receive no child protection. The only child protection committee in the Northeast is, and I'm talking more about the Northeast because it's.
Omar, I want to push you. We're running 2 minutes over. If you can get ready to close.
Yeah,
These are
yeah,
very
yeah.
important points. I just want to make sure you get everything in, realizing we're going to be cut off soon. Over.
Yeah, I would finish here. I would say that there is a huge need of, I would say, more programs to deal with acceptance in these communities as a step for reconciliation and then probably reintegration. I think the reintegration is still a bit far and a step for now within the current situation in Syria.
Omar, thank you very much. And Eric, thank you for your flexibility and support here. Jason as well, they're working behind the scenes with us. Our panelists have done what I believe is an exemplary job. We unpacked a lot in a short amount of time. Social, political, security, economic concerns around reintegration, the absolute need to reintegrate and treat statutory and non-statutory forces. Please get in touch with us. The emails are being shared in the chat. 1000% read Christina's paper. I cut her off and I'm going to pay the price, believe me. But the paper is, it was worth the effort, and it was quite an effort. The other papers, also give them a read if and when you can. They're quite informative. All roads lead to reintegration. one of the major findings of a high-level consultation convened with Creative Associates and Stimson Center last year, senior government, academic, policy thinkers, UN, and other representatives. I do want to thank you all for your time and attention, and particularly your interest. And to what I can only say is my esteemed panelists, thank you so much, and I'm sure we will be in touch. And with that, I will close the session. Thank you kindly, everyone.